Hello.
Hello.
Oh no, we have two Tylers on the call. It's going to get confusing.
I'll drop out.
Oh,
No, we go to the Thunderdome first.
Oh.
Hello. Oh. Let's see. How's the thing? There we go.
Andrew, Shu, we're in the SIG specification document, right, for this meeting? Just to double check on this.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Share the screen and then I'll put this in the chat as well. There you go. In case you want to follow along.
Hello, everyone. See Andrew's projecting. Please add yourself to the attendees list while we wait.
Hello.
I am usually the person who does a lot of talking in this meeting, or at least tries to lead a discussion. And I missed this meeting that happened, I believe, a week and a half ago or two between Open Metrics and Open Telemetry. So I feel unprepared to lead us into this discussion, but I'm very interested to have it. Does anyone here who was present on that previous meeting, is anyone here from that previous meeting who would like to lead us off?
I can.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Richie. That's great.
So we had the meeting last week. It was pretty good, I think. We had two main topics, basically. One is that we all agreed that it would make sense for us to just try and really work together, that there is a first-class experience for a Prometheus ecosystem from OpenTelemetry. The other thing is that in particular, Tyler wanted us to basically go through a few design decisions of why Prometheus, Cortex, Thanos did certain things in a certain way, and what the underlying learnings or things were why we did this, which is why I agreed to try and bring a few people from Prometheus team in once again, which succeeded. So yeah, that's a super short. Tyler, did I forget anything?
No, I think that's really good. Yeah, we went a little bit into some of the details. I'm hoping Bogdan gets on this call. Yeah, he was asking a lot of questions specifically around the things that are incompatible currently between the OTLP and the Open Metrics protocol. And I think a little bit as well as the clients as well, and trying to suss out if there is a possibility for compatibility going forward. And so I think the idea is that we were kind of left in maybe a state of wondering if that compatibility is possible or not, and wanting to get more opinions about it. I definitely see a lot more faces today, so I'm really glad that we're gonna have some more people involved in this discussion. So yeah, I think that was kind of the idea going forward. So yeah, maybe to just kind of jump right in. I think, again, we could probably just explore. I don't know if anybody on this call has really strong opinions as to whether the two projects can or cannot be merged, or should not be merged for some particular reason. I think that the general consensus from the last meeting is that, like, as Richie was pointing out, like, we should try to explore that. I don't know if anybody knows of any immediate incompatibilities that maybe we can try to just jump into and discuss to see if we can talk about like how those can be addressed. I guess is the way to start this.
I have a question. It's not really a conflict or a problem. The question is, if we decide to attempt some sort of merger or closer relationship or something, whatever that might be, do we want to explore changes to the OpenTelemetry metrics APIs to more closely match the Open Metrics model? I'm not saying one way or another pro con. I'm just throwing it out there as just a thing to ponder.
I might ask this sort of reverse question, John, which is whether there needs to be any kind of changes, or whether the semantics that we wrote up or have decided on for OpenTelemetry can be correctly converted into the Open Metrics data model and vice versa, which I think is true, probably.
I think what you say is probably true, but I think there's another consideration, and that is we should be considering our end users first and foremost when designing our APIs. And you know, we've gotten so many questions already in the APIs, where's my gauge? Like, yeah. If we don't do some sort of alignment, we're going to continue to get those questions, and maybe that's okay. But it is just a consideration. I like to try to think about the actual users, the end users at the end, like first and foremost, rather than us as maintainers. So that's my thought.
From what reading I've done in your repositories, you already have a gauge and a counter in a few different APIs. They're just called different things depending on how you access them. Like the Prometheus libraries have those as well, also called different things. And I think that as long as OpenTelemetry can produce valid, useful open metrics, we're good. But then there's a secondary question of, okay, there's things like info and so on. And okay, should that also be in the API so people can take full advantage of open metrics?
So we've had some discussion about how we think that the info concept of open metrics equates with the resource concept of OpenTelemetry. That's one of the conversations we might have. I have a few issues that I want to raise, but I'd love it if other people wanted to start this conversation.
Can I ask a fundamental question, since I don't have any background on this? Like, why did you initially never considered Prometheus as the data model or as the API? Like, what was the main reason that things diverged? That might maybe kind of help.
I'd like to try and answer that. So one of the ways I entered this project was as a tracing person who had worked on tracing APIs and the Open Tracing project. The concept there was that we're going to try and create a semantic definition for this API called tracing that we wanted to design. And so the concept of an interface that is purely defined in terms of semantics was born for tracing. And OpenTelemetry had to adopt that in order to merge with OpenCensus. In metrics, we did some research, and I, taking my kind of tracing hat, did some research to look into the semantics of the existing metrics APIs, and didn't find a lot of agreement between, say, the StatsD model of the world and the Prometheus model of the world. So in trying to find those semantics, we ended up finding some conflicts basically between those models. One of the things that came up is that the word gauge is actually used differently in a Prometheus and a StatsD type of ecosystem. And what we have found actually is, I find myself internally talking with people at Lightstep using the term cumulative gauge versus true gauge. And this sort of is associated with the distinction we're trying to make between the up-down sum observer and the value observer. And it's taken a while, I think, for us to really clarify this difference, but it's one that I think is a meaningful data model difference that is perhaps not present in open metrics that we'd like to explore. And this has to do with the freedom to sort of swap telemetry libraries that we are trying to enable with OpenTelemetry. And in particular, when you have metrics with mixed label sets, which is not something Prometheus ever really encouraged you to do. But when you do have metrics with mixed label sets, there is a meaningful semantic distinction between up-down sum observer and value observer. It has to do with the way we subdivide sums. So one library might be recording heap broken down by processor, like region or something like that. Like you can just subdivide a sum, and as long as you remember to sum them all back up at the end, it's the same. So one library can be running with 2 labels, and one library can be running with 3 labels. And if they're sums, they'll be summed correctly. And if they're values, they'll be averaged correctly. But if you mix those two, we get a difference. So that's one of the things that we found. And this has to do, why would we try to do that? Well, one of the things that comes up in tracing, and I think is a big distinction between StatsD and Prometheus, is something about statelessness. So StatsD libraries have always been stateless. And if you want to have a gauge, there's a question about what the semantics of the operations on the gauge are. We have this up-down counter instrument in OpenTelemetry, which is similar to the gauge operation in Prometheus, which has increment decrement, but not similar to the gauge in Prometheus that has a set operation. And if we're going to be stateless, we need to be able to encode those increment decrements as messages on the wire, not as state that we keep in memory. One of the things that we want to be able to do with our telemetry is swap in a new SDK that does something completely differently. And one of the things we want to do is not force you to take state in order to use one of these instruments. So there's a lot of differences here that I think we're finding because we want statelessness some of the time, and we want to accommodate those StatsD users. So that's sort of how this started. The only other thing I'm aware of is the start time question, which has been a point of contention, and I'm not sure where we sit right now. That's all I had to say.
Okay, if I can try and answer some of that. So the first point was around gauges and the different data models and so on. So that's what I refer to as there's kind of a distinction between semantics and APIs. Fundamentally, a gauge is a thing that is a snapshot of state. It can go up and down, keeping it very simple. And there's basically 2 ways you can do that at the API level. You can do a callback, and you can do some form of increment decrement set. So from an open metric standpoint, those are both a gauge. However, if you look at something like Dropwizard, what they call a counter is a gauge. What they call it's the gauge with increment and decrement, whereas their gauge is the gauge with callback. In Prometheus, the gauge is the one with increment and decrement, and depending on which client library you either use a custom collector or that. But it's a distinction between semantics, because it is a gauge semantically, versus what APIs are offered to the users. And that's kind of where the distinction is. But at the end of the day, they are still gauges in open metrics terms.
Yeah, and I'm trying to say we found 2 different distinctions of gauge, which is why we have a sum that's non-monotonic as opposed to a gauge value. But this is a data model, not an API question. And we could have these conversations separately.
Yeah, but from the standpoint of you've got OpenTelemetry data and rendering it into open metrics data, that distinction goes away, as it does in Prometheus generally. It's all a gauge on the wire.
Yeah, that sounds okay to me. I've been talking about this with internally at Lightstep. Like you have an up-down counter gets converted using state into a cumulative, right? So after all those pluses and minuses, you're going to have a bunch of gauge values. Now, if I have 2 dimensions in my gauge set, I'm going to have, let's say my averages are around 100 when using 2 labels, but using 3 labels, my averages are around 10 because that 3rd label just broke it down into more different sums. So there are more gauges now. If I'm averaging my gauges at the end of the day, the users that are using 2 labels and the users that are using 3 labels are producing different types of data. And we can't average those meaningfully. That's what this is getting at. If you have to sum the values with 3 labels down into 2 labels and then average them to be correct. But you're right, we can turn those back into gauges. And it's something of a philosophical debate as to whether you care to preserve the information that this was once a sum that's supposed to be added together with its peers versus this was once an individual measurement that can't be subdivided in any way.
I'm not sure there's a meaningful distinction there, to be honest. And that's kind of what the instrumentation labels go with, which comes to the second point I think you were saying. If you have the case, you have some metric, and in 2 different systems, it has a different set of labels, a different set of instrumentation labels. In OpenMetrics terms, those are 2 different metrics. They're not the same metric because they have different labels. They've got very different semantics. Now, it could happen that one of them is just a degenerate form of the other, and one label is constant, possibly even empty. But fundamentally, like if they have that extra label, adding a label is a breaking change on the metric because no one might have expected that.
So this is where OpenCensus kind of opened the box, and I working with Bogdan just sort of carried it forward. The idea that you can change your metric labels at runtime and configure a view to output, say, fewer of those labels meant we needed to know semantically whether we were supposed to be adding those things or, say, averaging those things.
Yeah,
in order to configure automatic reduction on the right path, we wanted to know more information. You're saying, and I agree, once you get done with your write path and you're just writing to storage, it's fine to call it a gauge at that point, but it might be dangerous to mix those 2 together with different label sets. And you're in the system that you've described, it's doing it correctly. It's treating them as separate metrics, which is okay with me.
Yeah, it does sound like I'm not fully sure what's going on here with average and sums. That sounds like it's getting into some of the more fun stuff we have to do for multiprocess for Python and Ruby. Because it turns out, do I use sum, average, last, min, max, all changes based on use case? So that's a rabbit hole, which let's sidestep it, because that's a complex design thing and it's all that requires user input. But at the end of the day, on the wire, you're going to provide a gauge with some labels. And if downstream, like in whatever monitoring system, people want to combine things that have different meanings because they're coming from different systems, that's just not going to work. Or at least not trivially.
One of the goals we had was to have these semantic conventions so that everyone can write the same metrics and hopefully have them have the same meaning. This is the rabbit hole that we're in, though. I think we can talk about it.
Essentially, the thing is one of the things I'm seeing here is you're concentrating a lot on these gauge values, and for the most part, so I'm in the site reliability engineering landscape, and so I'm almost never actually using gauges in production for any useful work, because I don't know what between my sample points in my time series database, I have no idea what a gauge is doing. And so I'm like 99.9% of my data is not a gauge. It's a counter, a cumulative monotonic counter, because I can't lose the data between one event and the next event. I need to know the delta between those. So I'm having to, in order to do that, I'm almost always keeping a small single, float 64 in my code to track that cumulative counter over time. And so I have to have some state somewhere to keep track of that cumulative counter, whether I'm doing it as a simple counter of the number of requests or a floating point counter of seconds, or have a complex counter like a histogram bucket series. And so like going back and forth on this gauge thing is mostly a waste of time because it's not useful data.
Well, so OpenTelemetry has tried to say that when you get a measurement of a heap size, which is a sum of individual allocations that might go up and down, that you call it a sum on the wire, and it's fine with us if you turn it back into a gauge.
Yeah, but I never
Really.
need that data. That's data
But
that I never use.
You do probably are monitoring heap size though. You've just been,
No.
I mean, okay, you don't monitor heap size.
We really
Great.
don't.
So the one example where this really does come up that I know of that people say whenever we're talking about it is, this is what I want to call the up-down gauge. Is I have some data going into a buffer and I have some data coming out of a buffer or a queue, and it's one physical queue, but logically speaking, I've got three label dimensions and I'm putting it in with my 3 label dimensions. And that means at any given time, I have a snapshot of what's in my queue broken down by 3 label dimensions. And now in the Prometheus world, you had to keep those 3 label dimension counts in memory, and the library does it for you. In the StatsD world, you just send some messages and that someone downstream computes it for you. And that's the stateless configuration that we've been talking about.
And we've had to give up on that. Like every organization that I've worked for that has any non-trivial size, we give up on StatsD because it's not scalable.
Well, but OpenTelemetry can fix the performance problem of StatsD.
It can't. Like you have to give up on StatsD and switch to an in-memory accumulator in your process.
Well, but we
Otherwise,
can do that
you
and
have
still
too many
flush
events.
deltas. That's the idea. You can still be stateless after the end of your flush. And that so you can make a high performance StatsD library, and many people have. And OpenTelemetry would have this roughly the same performance. And so I think if you boil this conversation about OpenMetrics versus OpenTelemetry down, one of the things that we really, really want from the OpenTelemetry wire format is the ability to have counters that you don't have to keep cumulatively in memory forever, because it lets you use higher cardinality. It means you can use labels however you want and throw them away, which every StatsD user out there, and there are many of them, is currently doing.
Yeah, but none of that data is useful over the wire.
So let's step back one step here. I mean, I think that for Prometheus and OpenMetrics output, all that is required is just that extra stateful processing, I assume. Like, is that fair to say? And if so, maybe it should be about just achieving that rather than trying to make any other changes to OTel in general.
I'm not even sure if this is about making changes to OTel or not. Like one of the main motivations of being here is basically the question of what design decisions did Prometheus make for what reason, and what hard lessons have we learned and what others might be learning from that. Not to try and force anyone to do anything, because I think that's like definitely out of scope for anyone who's not core OpenTelemetry. The one thing which I'm still unclear about is that even with deltas, you don't have, like, the state still exists, especially when you need to track which ingester last got which delta successfully. And you need to track this on both the instrumentation layer and on the ingester layer. And if you have any horizontal scraper or any middleware which is acting as a message bus or what have you, you even need to rebuild this type of state a third time. And that's one of the core things why we do have absolute counters, because you get rid of all this extra state, which is basically distributed in small little pieces to be picked back up later from all the places at once, instead opting to having only one counter to carry. And so, for example, with the OpenMetrics head-on, counters do not go away, which is usually not a problem in cloud native deployments, because you have short-lived processes and they only live even shorter. Microservices, nanoservices, serverless, it's just shorter. So a lot of this cardinality problem goes away by itself. Of course, you just have redeployment every X amount of time. So that's one of those things which I still haven't figured out about how OpenTelemetry really wants to approach them. But I think this is this level which Tyler actually wanted to discuss on, in as much as what lessons did we learn the hard way or maybe the easy way, and what could be used from there, and not discuss if it's possible to drop one label from a 3 label set and have 2 labels and thus have a different sum and an average. Because you can do this in the pipeline, you can do it in the ingester, it doesn't matter, as long as you transmit that state or that information somehow. So I think it's more about the high level stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I'd like to, hopefully we can pull it back a little bit, because I think at the end of the day, like the answer that I hope we can solve is the end user. Right now there's this question as to like somebody who's looking to implement or instrument some sort of new telemetry system into their code base, and there's a conflict here as do they, is open telemetry the right solution, or is open metrics the right solution? Obviously they're not a 1-for-1, like they're trying to solve different problems, but there is overlap. And I think it's the overlap that we're trying to address at this point in time, and understanding, my goal here is that there's compatibility. I think that's always been the goal of open telemetry. And I think Rich has been in a lot of our meetings. We want to make sure that open metrics is also like we have a working relationship, that we are going to be compatible. And so that is, I think, and I don't think that that's going away. And we want the end user to have support for both of them. The question is just, do we want to support both of them in the long term? So when the user is getting data out of an open telemetry system, an open telemetry instrument system, can it be in open metrics? How does that path look? And is there such thing as the OTLP, the open telemetry language protocol, that a user is going to need to support as well, or is that not something that's the case?
And just to be clear, most of what I saw in OpenTelemetry can easily be mapped into the wire format. So for example, those host-centric labels, or I forgot the name, but host-centric information which you mandate and encode in OpenTelemetry, that doesn't matter for OpenMetrics or Prometheus. Like, we don't prescribe it because we find it's useful not to do this for a variety of reasons, yet there's nothing stopping anyone from always emitting this kind of data. So the semantics of, do I have a host-centric view, yes or no, literally does not matter to the wire format or the ingester, ideally. You can just do it and you have 100% compatibility. So I think from the compatibility point of view, it's a lot more important to talk about, for example, if histograms are flipped upside down, and as such, you can't really do math between the two, and you can't really translate from one format to the other. Or like if you must support dots in OpenTelemetry metric names, how to recast those safely into an underscore only system, this kind of thing, because that's where the actual interoperability will be coming from. And not so much, again, any specific semantics which you're free to transmit and just define, or define and then transmit.
I'm still missing like so is the goal here to discuss whether it's unclear to me. It feels like an open-ended conversation. What's the actual, like, we're trying to decide on whether we could merge wire output and support wire output. Do we want, I mean, Tyler, you mentioned like long-term, could the project live without OTLP metrics exposition? Is that the driving factor? Like, it would help to have some framework into which, like,
Yeah, no, sorry. That's a good question. I'm probably not as prepared for this conversation as I should be. But yeah, I think that's a really good way. I think that's how we ended it last time. Is and we talked a little bit about this at the last metrics specification meeting. Is open metrics a wire format that is digestible by the consumer, and it's the last mile delivery of some sort of data for metrics in that format, or can it just be used as the wire format between the OpenTelemetry componentry, the OpenTelemetry instrumentation, and say the OpenTelemetry collector? Is it a replacement for that? Was kind of the open question. Could OpenTelemetry take the space of the metrics portion of the OTLP right now. Maybe even more so, there's maybe some more open standards for the OTLP to be replaced with, say, on the tracing side of things. But that maybe we don't focus too much on that side of that question, just the open metrics side of things and replacement for the metrics portion. And from the last our last meeting last week, it sounded like that may not be a possibility. And maybe we can kind of discuss that. I think that specific idea that we replace our version of metrics structure in the protobuf that we currently have with the open metrics structures.
Like one of the every other day problem is, a lot of people will never be moving off of, Prometheus. So, and they want to like at least in the collection and export path, they want to be able to rely on one thing that actually works for all. And like when they're looking at open telemetry right now, they see the Prometheus support. So they assume that it's going to work and it's going to work well. And I think that's kind of also creating some confusion. Like we have to like have a decision how much of support there will be to kind of like avoid that, expectation from the project. And, like all these conversations that we started around scraping, like how to, the Prometheus, the remote rider and everything, like we have to just kind of like, I think have some sort of like a goal. What we want to do with Prometheus, because it's kind of giving the wrong impression right now, I think.
Yeah, I refine that question. So I think OpenMetrics is a great protocol for human readable pull-based metrics. Full stop. That's what I think. I'm questioning whether the OpenMetrics protocol in protobuf format, not about text, but about like we're sending gRPC right now, is suitable as a push export protocol, especially for the collector case. Whereas we know Prometheus uses the remote write export protocol. And that's the confusion that Jan is referring to, really, is that we don't see how to use OpenMetrics for pushing and aggregating metrics data on an ingest path. We see how to use it as the last mile. And because we want to make sure that OpenTelemetry can push deltas, which Prometheus is never going to accept, we can configure OpenTelemetry libraries to be Prometheus compatible, and we've definitely stated that as the default. But we want to make sure that you can configure your OTel libraries to output deltas, meaning you're going to have this data that's not compatible with Prometheus. And that's what Jana is really also referring to, is that we don't know how to handle data in the collector, because we're expecting to have scalable pools of collectors running, and Prometheus is hard to make work in an OpenMetrics world like that.
I don't think that those goals are incompatible, because on one hand, whether you are push or pull, OpenMetrics works for both, forwarded cumulatives, because that's how it's designed, whether it's protobuf for text. And separately, if you want to push deltas as something else, you can as well. Like those are both allowed for. Because OpenMetrics only prescribes what happens in OpenMetrics.
It does not. Okay, I'm not sure there's a way to encode deltas and push them with OpenMetrics. These are sort of aside from all the questions about alignment with OpenTelemetry tracing and that I think are separate questions.
Yeah. So like OpenMetrics, you cannot encode deltas. It's against the spec. And that's just...
and to me, again, that makes really a lot of sense as a last mile, as a pull-based protocol. You don't need deltas. You shouldn't have them. They're meaningless. But as soon as we start pushing, we can't use OpenMetrics without adding deltas. And I hear the pushback is, this is hard to implement. We've never done this. Prometheus says you can't do that. But you can't ignore the StatsD world, and you can't ignore Datadog's dominance of metrics in the commercial industry right now. StatsD works for a lot of people, and we can't just tell them that they should start taking on state in their clients because Prometheus said it doesn't work.
Well, so this is a problem we also have in Prometheus, and that's why we have, for example, the StatsD exporter. I think there's one or two others, which basically take in StatsD, accumulate the state, and make it available for Prometheus.
It doesn't really matter which way the sidecar works, because like OpenTelemetry has the same currently for deltas into absolutes to support Prometheus, and again, it's just a question of where you have that state. And again, the one thing which I still haven't figured out is how you reliably detect who your ingesters are, who you push to successfully.
You only push to one, I think, is usually the way this is done, so that you don't have to track separate state.
Yeah, okay.
You could write to a file.
But
It
yeah,
would be
okay.
reliable. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
okay.
envisioning,
It's,
and there's also an open PR about item potency keys. This is a standard concept. Like, just preventing replays is all you need to do. And there are large scale systems that support deltas in the world. This is a solved problem. So one thing you could do is look at the Google Monarch paper. They supported deltas.
So hold on, why are we, I'm still a little bit okay, so that argument makes sense if what we're talking about here is like OTLP having nothing but open metrics for every piece of communication. But so is that bullish? Like, is that something that, I guess, I mean, and even so, like it could be used to encode, like there's no reason why it couldn't be used, I suppose, with different semantics, but use the same protocol possibly. Like, is this, where do you want to draw the line on, like, I don't think it's useful to like talk about push and pull and all that. It's like, you know, I think that we should be just talking about how does this impact the Open Telemetry project and its desire to support open metrics.
I've stated what I think would be the easy, hard to debate outcome is open metrics translated into open telemetry is 100% reliable. We can always do that. We can't always go back. So if open metrics were to sell itself as this is the bulletproof standard for text-based, human readable, pull-based metrics, or if you must, I mean, here's the thing, I don't think people want to take on a gRPC or a protobuf dependency and still, but they would be unwilling to take on an OTel dependency. Now, there are going to be 100 libraries written that just literally dump text on an HTTP endpoint, and those are viable open metrics implementations, and we want those to keep working 100%. But I think as far as the ecosystem we're building for pushing and gathering telemetry data, which includes trace data and log data, there's a pretty strong sort of reason just to continue using open telemetry OTLP. And that would say that we're going to input open metrics data, but we're hoping that platforms that consume metrics data will take OTLP in. And later we can talk about support for deltas, because that's, you know, users with higher cardinality would prefer to send deltas.
We are mirroring a lot of discussions with Google back in the day within open metrics, and especially Samir was pushing hard for push, which is why push is, in my opinion, a first-class citizen within open metrics. We did have extensive discussions around especially for high cardinality settings, to simply allow dropping certain counters. As in, like, currently, I don't even think we have a must, we have a should, that they should not go away, but I do not think that we have a must in there, which enables cardinality, gets away from all the state problems. And
that's based on the start time, correct? Like, you can reset your start time, and the assumption is the counter is still cumulative, but it's been reset. And then there's this thought experiment that happens. So cumulatives and deltas sort of degenerate. Like, you can call a delta a cumulative. It just happens to be reset every single time. And would that work in a Prometheus system? And I think I've asked you that in the past, Richie, and you said, I don't think so. If Prometheus servers are going to be upgraded to do true open metric support, then deltas will be assumed to be supported, because you can reset your start time every single report, and it should just work. So maybe you do support deltas. I've asked my team that the server came out of Google about this degeneracy case. Deltas and cumulatives may look the same, but very often in your ingest path, you need to know what the user is trying to do. Like, you're going to have to do like a read before a write in order to decide whether it's correct, if it's one of these reset every time cumulatives. I don't think you truly want reset every times cumulatives. That's why we explicitly declare what's a delta or a cumulative. It says my intention is to not reset this.
Yeah. So in spec terms, if you do it on every scrape, if you can even know who your ingesters are, that will break things pretty badly and is against the spec. Now, in principle,
wait. How come that's against spec? Because I think Samir thought that was on spec.
No, you can't reset
Pretty sure of that.
regularly. There is a little bit of wiggle room. You could reset rarely, as in rarely here might be, say, an hour, and that will be okay. But if you're doing it on the order of minutes, that might be a problem.
So I think that that's the thing stats2 users expect to work.
Brian, in Prometheus, isn't it?
I'm looking at the spec as of right now. You may reset to 0 and you must update the timestamp. So, and that's part of my point that OpenMetrics is pretty malleable about what you can transmit. That you will make certain ingesters explode and will have a lot of unhappy users if you basically shove deltas into a absolute counter system, basically building an event logging system within a metrics engine. That's a conversation which you will be having with your customers, and I will be very happy not to be part of that conversation. But from the raw point of view of the wire format, you can do this. And we did have discussions around, but not the time to finish those. And also Samir left at some point, and he cared most about the push model. There is especially the protobuf and especially the push is an area where we see room for changes in the future, provided that this is part of an overall design. And just one point, and I didn't get this from anyone in this call, but I forgot who told me. Monarch has been in production for 10 years now, for a little bit over 10 years, and the migration is still not done. So I dare say that Monarch did not solve all the problems, yet it obviously has a few very, very nice design properties. Yet it is not the solution to all. There's still Borgmon and such in production for high value properties by a certain hyperscaler. Of course, they couldn't get rid of this. Like there are things which didn't adapt to that operating model too well.
And I think this is why we end up saying both are okay. Push and pull, deltas and cumulatives, it's all okay.
Well, you're not saying okay, you're saying this is the default and it should always be the default. Whereas with my Prometheus hat on, we found that pushing deltas is not very reliable. And no offense.
We haven't made that. We've definitely set default to be cumulative. It means that Prometheus will be supported. The reason we had to do that is that if you're sending OTLP to a collector in a scalable pool of collectors, and that collector is going to then export Prometheus remote write or some other form, we need to be cumulative. So we definitely said that as the default behavior. But if you want it to be stateless and you have a system that supports it, and there are systems that support it, you figure stateless deltas.
Again, in my opinion, there is, and I think I read all the papers, there is nothing which really reliably has deltas without tracking state about successful pushes somewhere, but that's way beyond the scope of this call, I guess.
In the proto repo, I put a PR up about item potency keys. The idea is that you just literally write every data you receive to a database, and you keep a unique identifier, and you deduplicate with unique identifiers. So maybe you've dropped something, you could use sequence counters, but as with tracing, one of the OpenTelemetry goals was to separate API from SDK. We separated the API from the SDK so that someone can come in with a completely new idea and write an SDK that does it. So if you had, say, a development time only SDK that just wrote a log of all your events, that's one way to do this. And that SDK has no state in it. It just writes to a log.
Which seems to be more a case of having events which are then turned into metrics, if I just understood you correctly. The other point is
true, yeah. So we in separating the API and the SDK, we gave semantics to those events, and you can record events.
Okay, and the other thing with your basically deduplicating based on key is you may lose data, and you may never realize if you have lost data unless you encode some counter or some rising number, monotonically rising number ID in your IDs. you won't detect if you lose that data, and you can never get that lost delta state back, which is again one of the, like, it's totally fine to have a design decision to say that this is more important, in my opinion, and I think that's absolutely fine. Just I was trying to explain from the Prometheus point of view why the idea of losing data was basically made go away with absolutes, except for when you have a reset and you don't scrape at the right time. But that's a lot less than just dropping stuff under overload or something. Like, especially during load spikes, you would like to see what happened. And that's precisely when you start losing your delta. So those are the kinds of things which I meant initially with hard-learned lessons or lessons learned the hard way.
May I suggest we step back a second from like design decisions and trade-offs? If a user chooses that they want open metrics exposition, and the statefulness that is required for deltas to be accumulated, is there a problem with implementing that in OpenTelemetry?
As I understand it, currently no. In fact, that was a big part of our design, was to make sure that that was compatible with that format. Big part of the design was also, I think a large part of this discussion is the fact that we have a lot of different users that want to handle this in different ways. And so one of the ways that you just described is something that we tried to design for. So I think that is compatible.
Okay, well, that sounds good. Then it sounds mainly there's some minor details like, hey, how do we map the different types of gauge encounters and so on? Seems to be more to focus. And hey, does an info type need to be added, like the resources as you call them, I think, and how that mapping works is probably more the question. Because if a user says, hey, I'm okay with these trade-offs, then they're okay with those trade-offs.
Yeah, we've gone as far as specifying the default mapping into Prometheus so that this works correctly. Like an up-down sum observer must output a gauge, for example.
Yeah, the only place where I'd see that a user would need to configure things is what you do with sketches and the like. But everything else, I think you can hard code it basically.
Yeah, I think I agree on that. And we have been having a lot of discussion about histograms and sketches. If that's something we could talk about, the one irritating, outstanding problem we have coming from OpenCensus versus Prometheus is the use of less than or equals in your boundaries versus greater than or equals in your boundaries. And we've talked about it, and I wish Bogdan were on this call because I wasn't involved.
Yeah, that's also something we discussed in Open Metrics. I don't think it's practical to solve. I think you kind of just have to live with the fact that the equality, like that exact point, that single point on it is going to be different, and that hopefully won't matter much. I'm not sure, like the greater than less than, those are equivalent. The equals, you just lose them. I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it, unfortunately.
And then we've been discussing circle histogram, DD sketch, and so on, various different implementations of the histogram. And I know that there are some choices we could make that would just not work in a Prometheus world. And that's why circle hist is my favorite choice, but it's not clear that we can just make one choice. So we've got a protocol under development. I know Yuka is on the call that sort of is very similar to the Open Metrics, but it's got one extra field to support circle hist. We could talk about that now. Yeah, if Yuka is still on the call.
What a circle hist is, but I think that is a case where the user might configure, because you basically have two options as to how you convert this, as I see. Either you push it out as a quantile and just calculate it, or you push it into histogram buckets, which does require that it to be fixed in advance. So those are the choices, and I think that have to be user configured realistically.
Is there any reason why the Prometheus client library can't just be used for aggregation here? Like it sounds like I mean, all this would kind of not be really need to be discussed if you just use the default implementation of the Prometheus client library as an aggregator in process.
I think that's kind of
it sounds like going to an extreme. This doesn't sound like it's too hard to get right. We've been saying all along that our default should be Prometheus friendly out of the box. And And we haven't decided on histograms yet because there's a strong push to get variable boundaries, but we can make variable boundaries that are aligned on decimals that humans can read very easily. That's what CircleHist is, but there's an intellectual property and I can't necessarily push it. And so there's a problem there. We'd like to say the defaults are Prometheus friendly, but we'd also like to say the defaults are variable boundaries. It's hard to do that right now. I'm not sure how we can solve that one.
Yeah, so in Open Metrics today, not much you can do. Basically 10 buckets, choose wisely. However, for future versions of Open Metrics and in Prometheus, we are looking at ways to do this better and have certain set boundaries that handle this much more efficiently so it's practical. But like, this is a hard problem. As you saw yourself, there's many different approaches. I think like in the immediate term, what we're talking for, Open Metrics 1.0, it's okay, we have one of these. Do we convert it to a summary or a histogram? Sorry, a summary or a fixed bucket histogram. And it's pick your poison.
Yeah, and I think what we've been imagining is a case where we may come up with a default that uses fixed boundaries and is relatively fine-grained and then interpolates back to a relatively coarse number of boundaries on fixed boundaries. There's still new proposals being pushed. I know Google's got something I think personally pretty exciting there. There's this notion of UDD sketch that was mentioned last week, also really exciting. So there's room for improvement.
Yeah.
But this is all just within Open Telemetry though, right? Like pushing to the collector to aggregate. Like it's not actually, you're still going to output with fixed buckets, clearly defined boundaries, I would have expected.
That's what I was supposing as well. Yes. And I think that's the requirement that we're going to put before any of this code gets merged, is that we can demonstrate a collector pipeline with an exporter for Prometheus that re-buckets, because that's probably going to be necessary.
Just to note, we actually do have new histogram work being done. It's not in the Open Metrics 1.0 spec, but it will be in the next release. So
that's probably where we should be coordinating.
We are planning additional new features for Open Metrics that are not in the spec right now.
Basically efficient, high resolution histograms. Of course, this is one of the usual pain points in Prometheus land, and we are fully aware of this. Björn Rabenstein is leading this, who most of you probably know on this call. He hasn't had time to finish the design doc yet. I did see it early and it was super interesting. I can ask him if he's willing to share a preprint, as it were. Because that is basically what Prometheus and thus Cortex, Thanos, and Open Metrics will implement anyway. Because this is a pain point within the wider ecosystem.
Yeah, but that's still a little bit off anyway. We still have the Open Metrics 1.0, which doesn't have any of this. But from a Prometheus client library standpoint, this is how a summary is implemented. And it comes out like I right now have a pull request switching things over to in Java to whatever the standard one is. I've forgotten the name. But like that's just an implementation detail. And the on the wire, it just ends up being a quantile. So you just choose, hey, I'll have 95th, 99th, 99.9, which you can't aggregate subsequently, but well, quantiles are hard.
Yeah, so for example, in OTel SDK, we don't know how yet. We don't know how to decide whether you should output summaries or histograms. We need to choose a default, and then we need to, OpenCensus called this views, like you should be able to choose on a per instrument basis, and we don't have that yet either. This is really one of the big unsolved questions for OTel SDK, is just that we don't know how to set up that choice.
Yeah, I think by default, from a user-friendly standpoint and whatnot, even though it's not statistically the correct answer, is to use a summary, which is just some standard buckets like median, 99th, 95th, and have an option for that. Because, well, one of the problems with fixed buckets is you have to choose the buckets carefully. You can then aggregate them, but so I would suggest that just probably going for the quantiles is the least worst option. Maybe.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of different opinions on that one, especially with the sketch histogram stuff. But I am kind of interested, Rich, you talked about like this next revision of Open Metrics, including some sort of high resolution histograms and maybe a draft design doc. I know Josh had said that UK is on the call. it'd be cool if we could get a copy of that and run it by some of the people who have been thinking a lot of our sketch implementation in the OTLP to make sure that we have, again, like that compatibility going forward would be really ideal. I don't know if Rishi's, oh no,
Should we
No,
post that link?
I was just trying to find Björn in the internal Slack to poke him if he's able to, if he's around and when he thinks he can share something and such to just speed it up on that level, which is why I half phased out. So if you can repeat the last half, because I was basically looking for an answer preemptively.
Sorry, go ahead. I do want to ask though, like, if all the raw events are going from OpenTelemetry to the OpenTelemetry collector, like it still feels like this is an OpenTelemetry OTLP thing, not like when you choose to export to Prometheus, you need to feed in all the raw data into whatever aggregation protocol you're doing. So isn't this a last mile like consideration rather than like, I mean, maybe the configurability for the user might need to be lined up so that like you get the correct like exposition for OpenMetrics, but I still don't understand how the sketch work actually correlates to the two projects.
Well, we're implementing our own aggregators in a complete SDK where the notion of an OpenTelemetry exporter across the project is that it just takes some data and turns it into a protocol. There's no processing in the exporters. So that's why we've formalized, in the metrics world, we've formalized this design with an accumulator and a processor where the accumulator is fairly standard and high performance, and the processor is where you decide whether to be delta or cumulative, for example. And then an exporter is just a dumb, like, convert me into protocol bytes. So that's why the configuration discussion's happening for OTel, not for the exporters.
Okay.
And this is also the story for, like, I can attach a StatsD exporter, which is just a very small amount of code that turns data into a UDP packet, because all the high performance stuff has been done in earlier stages.
Yeah, I do have concerns that like the same thing that you do in a Prometheus client library and an OTel client library are going to be fundamentally different because of the minute implementation details of the re-implementations in both projects. Just that feels like it's fundamentally going to be a thing. I don't see how you can get 100% like accuracy between the two implementations, because they're going to be 100% two different,
well, I don't appreciate your pessimism, because I mean, that means we can't get our semantic story straight between any of these projects. We ought to be able to do this correctly, or else like nobody has semantics. Yeah,
but how do you, like a circle histogram, like all of the HDR histogram projects out there have minute little design decisions on certain bucketing things.
And that changes accuracy and precision, right? But the data formats all are the same. It's all,
yeah, the formats are the same. Mm-hmm.
And I guess our goal is to let you choose whichever histogram is the most sensible for you. And I guess if the Prometheus OpenMetrics this project thinks we should standardize that implementation, I'm all ears. I have no I mean, I don't think anyone here is particularly wed to any of these. Like, we just want highly compressed variable boundary histograms.
Yeah, like from the OpenMetrics standpoint, it doesn't matter what you have under the cover that's producing a quantile, whether it's HDR or sketches or circle hist or whatnot. The only thing that the spec says is that what you don't want is a histogram since the application started, because that could have been, months ago, and thus it's no use for ongoing real-time monitoring. So it suggests, hey, the data should represent the last 5, 10, 15 minutes. Like, that's the only.
So this is why, again, we have cumulative and delta. So if you have a cumulative histogram, it's going to be counts since the beginning of time. And you, a metric system, can difference 2 time points to decide what the change was there. And then this idea of a delta histogram is that we're going to reset every interval and flush, much like a StatsD would. And there has been an open discussion about whether there's some intermediate time range and whether we call that delta or cumulative or something in between.
Just FYI, the end users are going to suffer here. Like, even just that point that we talked about just then about the window for quantiles and separation, like, it's going to be fundamentally a very different experience. You're going to be the same application code, different libraries.
For
100%.
summaries, right? Okay, I think you're right about summaries because the time window is vague. So we should probably, you're right, let Prometheus do summaries if that's what you want. But my understanding going into this was that widely the idea was that summaries are not desired and that histograms are because they can be merged. So I don't know why we're recommending summaries or even talking about them.
That's fair. I mean, I just wanted to get on
thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to call out that. Go ahead.
So hold on, can I pause everyone here? We're at the hour, and I'm already not going to be respectful of people's time by continuing to talk. But I do kind of want to give a little bit of a summary here. It's just that, like, I think it sounds like cohesively, like a drop-in replacement of open metrics within, you know, the OpenTelemetry space for the OTLP is probably not something that we're discussing anymore. It's more of just the compatibility and making sure that OpenTelemetry is going to be able to support open metrics in that last mile delivery, talking about conversions of histogram and details of histograms and a lot of the naming discussions we still haven't even really kind of dug into, with the explicit understanding that there's going to be caveats to users that use OpenTelemetry to create open metrics around like making sure that they have to set it up correctly to ensure the guarantees that are defined in the open metrics specification. So if that summary is incorrect, please, I guess, I don't know, send me a strongly worded letter in the mail or something like that. But otherwise, I think that maybe we need to discuss a little bit more of the details of the naming versus the histogram sort of things. And I don't think that that's as critical time-wise. So if that could be maybe done asynchronously, or do we need another meeting to discuss these sort of things? I'm looking for maybe some group understanding on that one.
I think we can do that with a smaller group. I'd be happy to discuss it.
Okay. Cool. So maybe I can reach out to Brian and Rich after this, and we can kind of maybe address some of these things. I'm guessing maybe in like a subsequent OTEL meeting, or maybe something that works better for you guys. We can coordinate on that one. For the OTEL people, does that sound good as well? Okay, cool. Sorry everyone for all the time. Andrew, sorry about missing your time box, but I think this has been a fantastic discussion. So I'm really happy that we were able to have it.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Okay, everyone.
You guys.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.